A single, undifferentiated mass exploding into space, creating energy, matter, and time. Affinities form in the clouds of gas. A galaxy emerges. A star comes to life. The molten stuff of a planet settles into orbit, its surface cooling from incandescent fury. Elements join and condense into the sea primordial, through which a vast upheaval of the Earth's crust rises, forming an embryonic continent mixed with soaring precipices of new-made mountains, limitless plains, fiery volcanic towers, and Ohio.
Welcome to Prettium Podcast, part 4 of a series exploring the work and career of filmmaker John Hughes. In this episode, I'll attempt to talk about National Lampoon's The History of Ohio from the Dawn of Time until the End of the Universe, also known as National Lampoon's Dacron, Ohio, an unproduced script written by John Hughes and P.J. O'Rourke. P.J. O'Rourke was the editor-in-chief of the satirical magazine The National Lampoon from 1978 to 1980, helming the magazine at the time Animal House was released into theaters. O'Rourke was largely responsible for 2 of the biggest sellers that the Lampoon ever put out: National Lampoon High School Yearbook Parody in 1974, co-written with Doug Kenny, and the National Lampoon Sunday Newspaper Parody in 1978, co-written with John Hughes. If you're unfamiliar with John Hughes' work, you're probably listening to this podcast against your will. Hughes would later go on to write Vacation, The Breakfast Club, and Home Alone, but those were still a few years away. In 1980, Hughes had been trying his hand at screenwriting, and it was PJ who he turned to for advice. I became a full-time editor at the Lampoon under a new editor-in-chief, P.J. O'Rourke. I shared PJ's amusement with and affection for the unpretentious middle America of our mutual origins. We had worked together on a parody of a Sunday newspaper from the fictitious town of Dacron. It was a prodigious task requiring hundreds of ideas and tens of thousands of words. PJ had educated, trained, and conditioned me to write quick and often, and to look for humor where others hadn't. This was all happening during Hollywood's post-shampoo era of gold chains, red Ferraris, and big sideburns. As a print humorist, envisioning myself as Chicago's Booth Tarkington Jr., I willfully knew nothing of show business, except that it was a rich target for satire. PJ introduced me to the eminent literary attorney Morton Janklow, who advised me to go to Los Angeles and get an agent. When I arrived at the incipient Powerhouse Creative Artists Agency in my poplin suit and rep tie, I was mistaken for an IRS agent. Despite my contrastive definition of hip, I passed the audition and got the agent and the requisite accessory, the lawyer. After securing a copy of a screenplay to use as a format model, I returned to Chicago to write a script and inexorably alter my life for WGA scale. Thanks to the phenomenal success of National Lampoon's Animal House in 1978, O'Rourke, like Hughes and many other Lampoon writers at the time, secured a development deal. For one of his first scripts, O'Rourke was paired off with John Hughes to take the world of Dacron, Ohio, created for the yearbook and Sunday newspaper parodies, and somehow turn it into a script. Hughes had already written one screenplay, the failed Jaws 3 People Zero parody with Todd Carroll, and had a proven track record working with O'Rourke. At the top of the episode, you heard an audio recreation of the opening scene, which began at the dawn of time. The rest of the script is probably best described by this note attached to its first page. The following few words of explanation may help the reader to visualize a concept that will be obvious to the viewers of the film. The film depicts 6 generations of an Ohio family. Each generation is represented by a grandfather, a father, a mother, a son, a daughter, and the son's girlfriend. 6 principal actors are called for in the film, and they play the same respective characters in each generation. In other words, the actor portraying the grandfather in the first generation will portray the grandfather in all the succeeding generations. The actor portraying the father in the first generation will be the father in the succeeding generations, and so on. The concept referred to above is that through the use of hairstyle and coloring, clothes, and other personal characteristics, the grandfather character in the second generation will be made to look like the father character in the first generation grown older, and the father character in the second generation will be made to look like the son character in the first generation, also grown older. The mother in the second generation will appear to be the girlfriend in the first generation, grown older, and so on for those 3 characters in each succeeding generation. The script is a series of vignettes at different points in time. We first meet the Ohio family as they are shooing Indians away from land that they'd later call Ohio, and we follow subsequent generations through the Civil War, the Second Immigration Wave, World War I, Prohibition, the Great Depression, World War II, Vietnam, and eventually the future. In researching this episode, I read the entirety of the yearbook parody, set in 1963, and the Sunday newspaper parody, set in 1978, to see how much of the Dacron, Ohio that Hughes and O'Rourke had created had worked its way into the script, only to find that it didn't tie in at all. So where did the idea come from? Though the script doesn't seem to relate to a National Lampoon property, it shares a remarkable resemblance to another film that was being written at the same time.
"20 million years ago, an ape-like creature inhabited the earth.
In January of 1980, writer-director Mel Brooks was hard at work on a script of his own. I was walking across the car park at 20th Century Fox on my way to my office when one of the grips who had worked on High Anxiety shouted to me from the back of a moving truck, "Hey Mel, what's next? Planning a big one?" From out of the blue, the biggest title I could think of popped into my mind. Yes, the biggest movie ever made. It's called The History of the World. Somebody else on the truck yelled, "How can you cover the whole world in one movie?" "You're right," I shouted. "Maybe I'll call it History of the World Part 1. Brooks had already made several satirical and successful films, including Young Frankenstein, Blazing Saddles, the Hitchcock parodying High Anxiety, and The Producers. And Brooks shared a similar sense of humor to the Lampoon. I've been accused of vulgarity, and rightly so. I think that vulgarity, pointed properly, can be a good weapon in the hands of a creative person. Brooks's film was likely an influential factor in the storyline for the Dacron script, and O'Rourke and Hughes seem to have been tasked by Paramount to create what's known as a dueling movie, or twin film. These are films with similar or near identical plots or premises, released within months or days of each other by competing studios, often for box office numbers or simply bragging rights. A perfect example of this phenomenon is John Hughes' own Weird Science and Martha Coolidge's Real Genius, released in 1985, a mere 5 days apart. Both were comedies about the misadventures of young science prodigies. Though Coolidge's film was better reviewed, it was Weird Science, released a few days earlier, that managed to hold the box office. In Brooks's The History of the World, much like the National Lampoon Dacron, Ohio script, Brooks would play multiple characters from 4 points in time: the Stone Age, the Roman Empire, the Spanish Inquisition, and the French Revolution. By June of 1980, while the O'Rourke and Hughes script was still in a draft state, Brooks had begun the 16-week film shoot with a cast that included Dom DeLuise, Madeline Kahn, Harvey Korman, Cloris Leachman, and narration by Orson Welles. I attempted to ask P.J. O'Rourke in an email if he was aware of the Mel Brooks history of the world and if it played any part in the Lampoon film not getting made. According to O'Rourke, the film was only scrapped because he and Hughes couldn't figure out a storyline. But Brooks's film must have been instrumental in the studio's decision to abandon the Dacron script. Brooks was one of the most successful comedy directors in the world and an Academy Award winner, having won Best Original Screenplay for The Producers in 1968. 20th Century Fox had enough confidence in Brooks to back History of the World with a budget bigger than that of his previous 3 films combined, which was roughly $20 million, making it the most expensive comedy ever made at the time. A National Lampoon script, written by a yet untested John Hughes and P.J. O'Rourke, was unlikely to compete, even if they did somehow manage to solve the story problem. National Lampoon's The History of Ohio, From the Dawn of Time Until the End of the Universe, was shelved. Pretty In Podcast was written, produced, and performed by 517, which is my real name. Theme music is by Brad Davis of Fresh Snow, and incidental music is by Lumi Crystal, with the exception of Ben Hokia's Beautiful Ohio, recorded in 1920. You can look up Pretty In Podcast on Facebook and Twitter, and subscribe and rate on iTunes. Take a look at the show notes at prettyinpodcast.com for links to sources and the music used in the episode. Special thanks to P.J. O'Rourke for taking the time to answer a few questions. I'll put his full, albeit short, replies on the website. P.J. O'Rourke is the author of close to 20 books. His latest collection, Thrown Under the Omnibus, a collection of his best writing, including pieces from the National Lampoon, will be available in November 2016. During his time in Hollywood, O'Rourke worked on a total of 5 scripts. Easy Money, released in 1983, which PJ wanted me to know had an ending when the script was handed in, was written by O'Rourke and Michael Endler, Dennis Blair, and Rodney Dangerfield, who also starred in the picture. The film features early performances by Joe Pesci and Jeffrey Jones. It's a fun film that gets no respect. If you're still curious about how the history of Ohio from the dawn of time until the end of the universe might have turned out, Mel Brooks's History of the World Part 1 is a pretty fair comparison. It currently holds a 62% rating on Rotten Tomatoes.
Wait! Where are you going? Coming soon!
Next time on Pretty In Podcast, Joy of Sex, the motion picture. Joy of Sex, directed by Martha Coolidge and written by Kathleen Rowell and J.J. Salter, was released to theaters in 1984 and is available to watch on the Epix streaming service, unfortunately only available in the U.S. A terrible transfer can be found on YouTube if you're desperate. Here's the trailer.
Come on, Les. Millions of women do this every day.
Somewhere between virginity and senility is paradise.
Everybody's getting it with me.
Alan, will you light my Bunsen burner? Alan, will you light my Bunsen burner?
Joy of Sex.
How about you, buddy? Do you puff up?